In the late 90s, a group of developers came together under the banner of the Steel Hearts team. Led by future Capcom developer himself, Mitsuo Kodama, the team was enlisted by Psikyo to make a fighting game that would become known as Daraku Tenshi, or The Fallen Angels in the Western world. Or at least it was supposed to be called that. Due to a hilarious twist of fate, the game became known as Daraku Tenshi, The Fallen Angels in the Western world. This means we essentially call the game The Fallen Angels, The Fallen Angels. Let me explain. The Japanese name of this game is Daraku Tenshi. If you translate that, it's something like Degradation Angel, or Fallen Angel, funny enough. Psikyo had big plans for this game, but due to troubled and mysterious development cycle we know very little about, most of the ambition was left on the cutting room floor with the lost character Jimmy's. You see, Daraku Tenshi was rushed to completion and released in June of '98, only in Japanese arcades. Per a listing on the USA's copyright database from 1998, Psikyo had filed a trademark for The Fallen Angels, which had been the game's official US title had it gotten released. Said trademark sadly lapsed. Despite a lack of an official USA release, there is a dip switch option in the game which, when enabled, turns the game into Fallen Angels mode, changing up the title screen and translating the game's win quotes, story text, and more to English. When the MAME team first added this game to MAME, they defaulted the game to the USA dip switch mode and titled the game in the ROM list Daraku Tenshi, The Fallen Angels, with a colon in between the two as if Fallen Angels was a subtitle or something. In reality, it was more of a case of two titles across two regions, but not really, since Daraku Tenshi and The Fallen Angels mean the same thing. Now, if you don't speak Japanese like most Westerners tend not to, then you'd assume that the game was Daraku Tenshi, The Fallen Angels, as in it's a game called Daraku Tenshi, and it's about some fallen angels or something. But that's just a theory. While unknown fighting game prototype BB is still the best 2D fighting game ever made, The Fallen Angels is definitely my favorite one of all time. If you don't agree with that, then you're wrong. I don't see how anyone could look at the small roster, drab color palette, and very hit-or-miss music and not agree with me. Sadly, it seems most people didn't, as Daraku Tenshi appeared on the scene in 1998, doing fairly well in Japanese arcades, with interest fizzling out for more notable titles in the months to come. Despite its release and fade into obscurity, DT is a textbook example of a cult classic. How is it that this rushed Japan-only fighter that the West only knew about via MAME years later became one of the most beloved obscure fighting games of all time? Join me for an in-depth look at The Fallen Angels, as I talk about why I love this game and what I think the actual reason is people love it so much, and the paradoxical nature behind it. Daraku Tenshi's story is complicated, not like Kingdom Hearts has a complicated story, but like complicated in how you have to figure it out, even if you can figure it out. You see, most of its characters don't have an ending, and the ones that do aren't in the game unless you count win quotes. Like I said, it's complicated. If Dark Souls has an extremely rich story and it's just hidden away to those who seek it, Daraku Tenshi's story is the Citizen Kane of environmental storytelling, requiring you to literally use the Wayback Machine to figure it out from old documents. One thing we do know with certainty is the setup for this game's fighting. A Japanese city suffers an earthquake and breaks away from the mainland, becoming an island of its own and descending into chaos. Eventually, the control of a crime boss named Carlos, who begins performing a host of atrocities in his new city. The game's cast is a ragtag bunch of misfits who are in the newly renamed City of Eden for various reasons, some power players in the conflict and others just trying to survive and not be experimentated on. DT had a troubled development. Psikyo got tired of waiting and the game had to be wrapped up unfinished. So much of what was planned for it ended up being cut. The Steel Hearts team had intended to give the game not only character endings, but story interludes between each fight, meaning each character would have a story path through the game in arcade mode. Whether this was meant to be in the arcade version or a future console port is unknown, but it was fairly ambitious for a fighting game at the time, especially for a new team like the Steel Hearts. The final game ends up taking more of the Tekken approach, with only an intro and interludes given for the arcade mode. The problem is, while Tekken eventually came to consoles with the full story endings, DT never got a home port. We'll talk more about the game's story and its characters later, but for now let's talk about the gameplay. Daraku Tenshi is a 4-button fighter, much like KOF and other SNK titles. Each character has a light and heavy punch and a light and heavy kick, and various normals that are executed by using the joystick in conjunction with these buttons. Special moves are executed with traditional quarter circles and charge motions. There's no Kaneko-style oddball move combinations here, thank goodness for that. The game also has several mechanics which will be readily understandable to fighting game fans. There is a power meter and a guard meter under your health bar. The power bar charges as you take damage or as you dish out damage. Once it fills, it begins flashing temporarily. While it's flashing, you have access to one of your character's super moves. Using a super will immediately empty out the meter and set it back to empty. When your character is in low health, their health bar will begin to flash red, which means you have unlimited access to your super moves. If you execute a super in red health while your power meter is full, your character will do an enhanced version of the super. Some of these get extra hits or effects visually, but many of these just do a little bit more damage without really drawing attention to it. You can also taunt to lower your opponent's power meter while leaving yourself open, as well as charge up like Yusuke Urameshi from Dragon Ball Z to fill up the meter quicker. The game also has a guard meter. When in neutral, after blocking, your guard meter will go back to 100. But taking successive attacks without any action will eventually result in a guard break, leaving your character temporarily vulnerable. Nobody tell Tekken Tag 1 haters, but Daraku Tenshi also has a variable health system too, and characters with lower health will lose guard faster and have it recover at different rates. Despite being a team manned by future SNK developers, Daraku Tenshi plays very down-to-earth for a 2D fighter. Some characters have dashes or full-out runs, but matches play out much more blow for blow and less chaotic when compared to CPS2 games or old-school UMK3. The fighting feels somewhat realistic for a 2D game. In Dadango Benkei, the Ball and Angels, only 2 playable characters have projectiles. Cool throws darts, which are unlimited and extremely weak, and Harry can shoot rockets, but he is limited to 6 per round, and using them cuts down the damage of one of his super moves. Speaking of supers, due to the way the game's resource accumulation works, supers are a fairly common sight in gameplay both casually and competitively. Despite this, the supers don't really wear out their welcome, and gameplay turns into a fun cat and mouse game. There are only 8 playable characters, so you can at least get familiar with each character and what they do in a short amount of time. This means matches will come down to who can maneuver themselves and their character better versus the other. You may say that that's every fighting game, and it is, but ask a Daraku player about this meta and they'll know what I'm talking about. Counter supers and punishers are very important when it comes to learning to play DT effectively.
Choose your destiny.
If you bring up the Fallen Angels Daraku Tenshi to a fighting game fan, most of them that aren't familiar will say it's that cult game with no story that was unfinished, and while that's fairly accurate, it doesn't paint the whole picture. I've created the video game story exposition scale to help you understand. As you can see, the Dark Souls series falls onto the far left of the chart, meaning there is a story. It's not given to you other than the intro, and if you want to understand it, you'll have to follow From Software's legendary environmental storytelling and piece together hundreds of pieces of flavor text, environmental cues, NPC dialogues, and boss names in order to figure out a gist of what happened. Metal Gear Solid, on the other hand, stops gameplay after every section to give you an hour-and-a-half long exposition dump that not only explains the story to you, but explains to you what nanomachines are. Daraku Tenshi falls right about here. There is an intro story, and there's text in the game that alludes to each character's relationship to one another, but that's it. There's 2 cutscenes, both of which are just to introduce bosses, and that's it. Characters give 1 or 2 dialogue lines to each other after every fight, and that's it. And a handful of characters have character-specific intro dialogue, and that's it. What separates DT from Dark Souls is that the developers did plan out a fairly ambitious story with interludes between each fight for each character, full-on endings and more, but they didn't make it into the game itself. Instead, much of this content was left to languish online, bubbling up in extremely hard-to-find places. Psikyo's official webpage hosted bios for the characters for years, and more story information was dished out by DT development member Hajime Ito on his personal website, which you can now only find via the Wayback Machine. He also released several development storyboards which showed the game's unimplemented cutscenes and the endings for some characters. Now, there's a ton of info about this game's story that has been uncovered throughout the years, and this review would go on well over an hour or more if I stopped to discuss it all here. Instead, for now, just rest in the knowledge that the city, and production documents reveal it to be the Japanese city of Osaka, an Osaka borough, mentioned in the intro, is home to our playable cast, and each one of them has a beef, not only with the other cast members, but the crime kingpin Carlos, the game's final boss. If you're interested in depth, I highly recommend checking out my Obscure Gaming Uncovered video about this when you can. If you start to combine the quotes in the game with the out-of-game developer material, a lot of each character's relationship to one another in the overall plot starts to come together and make a lot more sense, however still remaining largely shrouded in mystery and obscurity. Many of the characters in Daraku Tenshi have an epithet or title that they go by in official sources. Cool is known as the Black Wing of Zone 4. What this exactly means was never really expanded upon because the game's story got its wings clipped, but Cool himself is a charge character and is literally Guile, but just a member of My Chemical Romance. Cool's moves are Darts of Black, a fairly quick but useless projectile that some characters have time to jump over and punish on reaction, and Guile's Flash Kick. Cool has two super moves, which are just stronger versions of his regular attack. The number of darts thrown or flip kicks executed after landing the move changes depending on the state of his power bar and how much health he has when the super is activated. Hajime-bu, or the 8th Mad Dog, is a survivor of Carlos's genetic experiments. Thanks to this, he can't feel pain, and this is actually worked into his moveset as he has a move that gives him super armor while he's charging it at the cost of being able to take free damage. Haiji has the most supplemental story information inside and out of the game, and it appears that the Steel Hearts team thought of him as the game's protagonist. Of all the leaked storyboards, his are the most complete. Haiji has 4 special moves and 2 supers. Howdy. The unfortunately named Harry Ness is voiced by the late Daisuke Gori. Harry is one of the game's few lawful good characters and is a U.S. Marine who is sent to Eden to deal with the situation. Supplemental material reveals that he was deployed specifically as a result of Carlos hacking into the CIA's database. He has a bit of character-specific dialogue with Torao, who taught him martial arts sometime prior to the game's start. Harry is one of 3 characters to have actual projectiles, but he's limited by an ammo count under his health bar. Managing these rockets becomes integral to his gameplay, as one of his supers gets weaker the more rockets you use. In addition to his rocket projectile and anti-air kick, Harry has a command grab which does great damage and a super version which does stupid high damage. Ruscio Roche, whose name I'm pretty sure is a pun on a type of fish, is an Italian assassin with ties to the Italian mob, in particular a man named Don Corneo whose story did not make it into the final game. Roche never speaks a word to any character in the whole game, although he does speak a few Japanese words during some of his super moves. He's obviously been hired by someone to knock off Carlos, but with the game's story on the cutting room floor, we'll never really know who it was. Taro is a big-bellied but jovial Frankenstein's monster of a character who fights with pure power. His moves are fairly punishable, but dang does he hit hard. Concept art implies Taro was a normal human and is the way he is now due to one of Carlos's failed experiments, possibly even the one that produced Haiji. Taro is a mutual friend of Urien and Urien, and post-fight dialogue between the 3 of them suggests that they go way back.
It stinks.
Sure does.
Toriao Onigawara is an homage to an old anime character known as Karate Baka Ichidai. Seriously, look up the intro on YouTube, it's the same character but older. He's a homeless martial artist who hasn't had a bath in some time and fights in a back alley, probably out beside the brothel. In the past, he taught martial arts to the American military, much like real-life martial artist Tatsuya Shimabuku, the founder of Ishinryu Karate, did in Okinawa post-World War II. Harry is a former student of Toriao's, and despite the gi, Toriao isn't a shoto per se, but his easy to pick up and understand gameplay is often a favorite of new Daraku players. Whereas Harry has a projectile and an anti-air kick, Yuri-Ann, that's with an A, is a pure grappling character. She has a dislike of her brother Urien, with whom she runs the Windfish Bar and Grill with. However, they don't seem to stoop to trying to kill each other like Anna and Nina Williams from Tekken, and work together begrudgingly to run and protect the bar. There is a ton of backstory on this character that got moved from an NPC who was cut from the game early in development, and that makes Yuri-Ann and Yuri-Ann's history super interesting, but unfortunately I don't have time to cover it here. Yuri-Ann is voiced by Aiku Otani, who also voices Pikachu, by the way. Urien is a man who dresses as a woman and sings in the Windfish Bar to attract male customers. Urian is his sister. As stated previously, Urien and Urian don't really like each other, but put aside their differences to run the Windfish. Urien is another character who is part of a really interesting story beat that was sadly cut for the final game. It's hard to say what the developers still considered canon by the time the final game was released, but again, check out my Obscure Gaming Uncovered video on the subject for more. Urien fights with an all-around set of moves including a dash punch, 2 anti-air kicks, an air throw, and a fairly pointless parry. Vash the Stampede, Trigger, is the game's sub-boss and is unplayable without using MAME hacks or cheats. Apparently during development he was going to be a character face mid-game like Asura Blade's Vebel and maybe even made playable. But in the final game he is just a standard sub-boss, a Russian assassin hired by Carlos to kill the player character's fighter for getting too out of control, as Carlos puts it. Trigger can be annoying if your character doesn't have the tools to deal with him, but he's not nearly as dangerous as Carlos, at least when played by the AI. His only 2 moves are a double gunshot, which covers the full screen instantly, and an anti-air gunshot where he falls on his back and shoots in the air. He also has infinite bullets, unlike Harry's rockets. His super move is just him shooting you several times. Trigger has some hilariously cruel things to say to the characters when he wins, but is sadly another victim of the game's cut story. Much more was obviously planned for him, but in the final game he's just here to fill the role of a sub-boss. There's also some light evidence he may have a backstory with Harry, which makes sense as Trigger is a Russian assassin and Harry is a USA Marine, but this is all tentative speculation at best. After recording Trigger's info section, I realized he does have one more move I forgot to mention. Yeah, I guess you'd call it a command throw. If you input the motion, he does an attack. If the attack hits, he flings you up in the air and shoots you. It's pretty cool, actually. Genetic engineering, cybercrime, assassination, organized crime. Carlos has lots of irons and lots of dubious pies, and it has earned him a target on his back. If you swing at the king, though, you better not miss. Carlos fights with one hand in his jacket and a katana in the other. His SNK boss syndrome means he doesn't really need the extra hand, though. In a game that tries to stick to somewhat realistic fighting conventions, Carlos's sword affords him insane reach and damage. If you get hit by his super at anything less than full health, the round is pretty much over. Carlos's main threats are his ridiculously high range and high damage normals. He has only 3 specials, a sword charge and a skyward stab, and his super move, which is a leaping sword strike. If the strike hits, your character is stunned and he turns his back before saying sayonara and jump stabbing you, eviscerating your character for more than half your health. Although sometimes you can get off easy depending on where you were on screen when he hit you with it. Beating Carlos with the game set on anything but the easiest difficulty will involve knowing your character's moves and their frame properties very well so that you can figure out what you can safely punish Carlos with and lock him in place. Urien has much success locking him into a corner, while Harry will need to trick him into a command throw loop. Cool will need to use MAME cheats to give himself infinite health, etc, etc. If you manage to knock him out, Carlos will yell a manly which is to say, I. Hey kids, it's the 90s, it's a fighting game, it's in the arcade. What do you expect? You'll pick one of the game's 8 playable characters and fight the other characters, on their stages no less, until you conquer them all. As mentioned earlier, Daraku Tenshi was rushed out the door, and there are no endings other than your character's brief comments to Carlos after winning, but they say that to all the other characters too, so is it really an ending? There are 2 cutscenes before fighting Trigger and Carlos, though. Had the planned fight interludes not been cut, I think it would be very safe to say they would function a lot like these 2 do. DT's single-player experience is very similar to arcade Tekken in that the story is kept to a minimal, even though you can tell there's supposed to be one. The AI in the game isn't too punishing, believe it or not, and most competent fighting game players probably won't start to have issues until they reach Trigger and Carlos. Trigger and Carlos are annoying, but with a little bit of know-how and cheese strats, you can take them down without too much issue. Again, after beating Trigger and Carlos, there are no real endings, just the credits and a name entry screen. That said, let's talk about
Cut content.
I can't go into all of it here, but the game has a ton of cut content. Beyond what has been talked about online, Hajime Ito's defunct blog, and my own YouTube channel, you can find a ton of info about cut content and characters just by snooping around the game's test menu. During the game's credits, images will play in the background showing various pieces of concept art, and among them are some things that look like they could have fit in a cutscene somewhere. Many of these images line up with scenes that are sketched out in the game's leaked storyboard images that are online nowadays. This means they very likely were scrapped story sequences that didn't have time to be added. Most famously, they are sprites for 4 unused characters that got canned prior to the game's launch. Information about these characters has been leaked online. If you want to know more about them, check out my Daraku Tenshi Uncovered video, but we'll touch on these 4 since they are the content most people will find interesting. Lapis is a spunky girl with a whip and an Indiana Jones-esque vibe. Hajime Ito says about as much on his old blog, saying that she was going to fight with the whip you can see placed on her side. No doubt the DT developers who went on to work at the King of Fighters used her as an inspiration when they created KOF's own whip user, the uniquely named Whip. Lapis is the only cut character to have her storyboards partially leaked. Her father was an archaeologist named James who discovered some sort of ancient tablet that was the secret to unlocking some sort of great power. Carlos has the tablet but has no idea how to use it and is thus pursuing Lapis as a means of unlocking it. Snake is this mini belted character. Very little is known about him other than what can be gleaned from Hajime Ito's blog. It was said that he was a very slimy guy personality-wise and was the enemy of Taro in the story. Curiously, if you check the Daraku Tenshi sprite dump, you'll find sprites for the 4 unused characters all in a row, but an action sprite of Haiji is in the place of where Snake should be. For the longest time, it was unknown how his sprite ended up online, but it had to have come from Hajime Ito's blog. The first place I remember seeing it was on the Daraku Tenshi unofficial website, circa 2007, but Hajime Ito's blog predates this, so he's the likely culprit. This bare-chested kickboxer is a bit of an enigma. Early days on the internet, he was just known as another canned DT character, but when X-Gargoyle exploded the DT community with his rediscovery of the DT storyboards, it was revealed that this character's name was Sid, but unfortunately not much else. He does show up at one point in Taro's storyboards to say, quote, Carlos is behind everything, but that's about it. Probably the most infamous of DT's unused characters is the more than bare-chested Jimmy. This sprite is deep in the game's ROM, and the developer-made sketch of Jimmy and Carlos turned up online years ago. Probably another relic of Hajime Ito's blog. Being in college at the time, I asked my college dorm's RA, who was Japanese, to translate it for me, and he provided this translation. Hi, I'm Otani. The right one is Carlos, and left one is a character who was deleted by mistake, Jimmy. If I had power a little more, you wouldn't be deleted. I'm sorry, Jimmy. Otani is one of the names of the developers of Daraku Tenshi, so no doubt this sketch was his, or at least the verbiage written here was his. It's interesting to note that Jimmy's shoulder bears the same tattoo as Haiji. Storyboard documents confirm that Jimmy was actually supposed to be the brother of Urien and another cut character named Maya, another lost sibling from the early story. This is supposedly a picture of the cut sibling Maya here. Now, Jimmy was kidnapped and subjected to genetic experimentation to make him inhumanly strong. I reached out to Daraku Tenshi director Mitsuo Kodama on Twitter a few years back to ask why the heck Jimmy was naked, and he mentioned something we didn't know up until then. Jimmy wasn't just another character. He was going to be a boss character that you would have fought even after Trigger as bodyguard to Carlos. He also mentioned him being naked as a way to make him appear very strong but also childlike in disposition. Before Maya, the NPC mentioned earlier, was dropped, Carlos was supposedly after her due to her shared genes with Jimmy, making her adept for whatever foul genetic genocide he was planning. This story beat seems to have been given to Urien in the final game, as Carlos refers to her as merchandise when he defeats her in the single-player mode. I have personally torn this game's files up and down to try to find any extra sprites, sounds, or data for these characters, but other than what's in the sprite and bitmap dumps, there doesn't appear to be anything. Other than the obvious bitmap dump stuff, the only other unused thing is a police car siren noise that appears in the game's sound test. Daraku, like other Psikyo games of the era, has a special test menu that you can access by hitting the test switch and holding player 1 punched to get access to a few additional options. Beyond this additional test menu, there is a further additional debug menu hidden in the game's files with text referring to some of the commands that would have been available. However, it seems to have been totally dummied out and no known way to access it exists. Why yes, there is an active competitive scene for Daraku. Back in the day, with the help of my message board members, we set up the legendary Daraku Fridays, where we would log on Caliera every Friday night and play long sets of DT and other obscure gems. Every character saw use, and community members like Merlin, Hall 665, Clear Sky, and myself, and more would hop on every Friday night to play. Eventually, DT nights faded out as life happened, but the rise of Fightcade and Discord has reignited this passion. Old guard like Clear Sky and Plexo have been joined by more DT fans, casual and competitive alike, to keep the game rolling on Fightcade. The game is also a staple of one of Japan's most famous arcades, Mikado, and we're fortunate enough to have with us, oh no, I didn't figure out how to pronounce his name since the last video, as our Japanese contact who keeps us up to date on the latest happenings with the JP Daraku Tenshi community. Like most 90s fighting games, the higher of a level that you play out, the more the field of characters that you see used slim. But unlike other 90s fighting games where you have one or two viable characters in the hands of experts, all characters are fairly viable in DT, but some characters are more viable than others, if you catch my drift. In the earliest days of the Daraku Tenshi scene in the USA and West, Roche was considered to be top tier mainly because the AI Roche will wreck you with very long combos if you don't know how to defeat him. This stance changed over time, and we saw how wrong that take was as more and more info began to trickle in from the Japanese scene. Urien and Urian, once thought to be middle of the pack, quickly began to be rightfully seen as the best characters in the game due to their insane pressure and combo potential. Much of the highest level Daraku Tenshi therefore unfortunately becomes locking people down with Urian's punches, Haiji's combos, or Urian's insane overhead. High-level Urien play looks not too different from UMK3's jab pressure. I once, again, went back to the well of, still don't know how to say his name, and asked him what the word on the street was in Japan for the current DT balance, and he had this to say. That's difficult to answer, to be honest, since recently I've not played as much as I used to, but Urien and Urian are definitely the top tiers with no doubt, and Haiji and Harry are still thought to be high tiers. The community in East Japan has much more knowledge of low tiers than I, and we've not had a good chance to play each other, to confront each opinion, so I'm not sure how they fit in the tier list. Also, we recently discovered some new combos which we've not tried yet. For example, I realized Urian's Practical Infinite without the reverse neutral cancel. If any part of you feels like you want to pick up DT or even just learn more about it casually, I highly recommend joining the Daraku Tenshi Discord, where you'll find not only channels for discussing the game competitively, but for discussing lore, updates on the complete edition, and more. As for a beginner character, I recommend Shoto fans pick up Toriao. He's not really a Shoto, but he has a simple game plan and is plenty strong enough for a beginner. If you want to go for a strong character out of the gate, pick up Urien for the simple game plan and incredibly high ceiling. If you fancy a grappler character, you can choose Harry or Urien, with Urien being harder to learn but having a higher ceiling. If you're a fan of charge characters, there's tons of other fighting games you can pick. I'm just kidding, you can play cool, but he has for years been considered the lowest tier character while still being viable if you absolutely know what you're doing with him. So someone told me to check out this video. Let's go. Criticisms? One of the reasons I wanted to do this review was to be able to step back and look at this game objectively and see its flaws. It goes without saying, but the game is unfinished, at least based on what the developers originally intended. The missing story content and extra characters are all extremely regrettable, but this is the human condition, to want to know what you don't know and then stop caring once you know it. If Daraku Tenshi had been completed with a full story and character endings, would anybody care as much about it as they do today? DT, like many 90s fighters, becomes less fun the better you get. I don't mean that you can't enjoy enjoyed the game at a high level, just that certain characters, namely Urien and Urien, are leaps and bounds above everyone else at competitive level, and the strategies they employ to control the match aren't the most exciting or fun to be on the other side of. Urien, in particular, seems to have been added last minute to round out the roster, as almost no pre-release info for her exists, and she's literally just Urien with the dress sprite removed. Coincidentally, she's arguably one of the most unbalanced characters alongside Urien. Playing DT at a high level doesn't feel so busted that you can't enjoy it, but there are very many things that you see and go, that's not very fun. With just a little bit more time in the oven, DT could have been one of the most well-balanced 90s fighters ever, but alas, it just wasn't meant to be. The fact that only 8 playable characters made it exacerbates this issue because it's so easy to see what everyone else does. 4 more playable characters might not have solved that entirely, but it certainly would have added more variety to the game. This being said, the character sprites are all top-notch, but despite the gorgeous sprite work and obvious love and detail that was put into most of the backgrounds, some stages like Taro and Toriao's are very basic. Taro's stage in particular has a strange, almost watercolor painting-esque quality to it that makes it seem muddier than the crisper backgrounds like Urien and Urien stages and Trigger stages. Famous one-credit clear streamer BBH also made a joke one time about all the brown in the game's color palette, and once you hear that, you really can't unsee it. It definitely fits the game's aesthetic, but if you like a more colorful Capcom-esque outing, you'll find the art a bit lacking in this regard. The game's soundtrack actually got an official CD release, oddly enough, though most of the tracks aren't much to write home about. Cool stage theme is pretty good, and Urien's is neat, but the rest of them are much more melancholic background themes that don't really make you pumped to listen to them on your morning jog. They do their job well enough, but that's it. All that said, I do legitimately enjoy DT's gameplay, at least at my level, somewhere between competitive and casual. Matches have a very tit-for-tat, yet still fast-paced feel about them that's closer to Tekken than King of Fighters in my opinion. Pulling off the correct punish into a super or correctly dodging an attack to punish it feels amazing, and the much more down-to-earth nature of the combat makes it all feel more believable. Had the game been completed, I assume that it would still be played today in a very limited capacity, similar to what classic CPS2 games enjoy. DT released unfinished in 1998, and the Steel Hearts team disbanded after and went their separate ways. Daraku Tenshi released, and from what I can tell was fairly popular in Japanese arcades before being relegated back to obscurity. It's a shame that game developers tend to vehemently fight against emulation of their old titles, because The Fallen Angles was almost certainly plucked from obscurity by people discovering it on MAME. The rise of MAME and the relative stability it offered for playing classic arcade games gave rise to early online options such as Caliera, which offered fairly unstable but serviceable online play for several old arcade titles for the first time ever. Because of the game on MAME, users like Thor, aka Daraku Tenshi here on YouTube, that's his username, folks, created the unofficial Daraku Tenshi website, which is unfortunately now defunct, and led me to create the old Daraku Tenshi Envision free forum, which still exists to this day as a Tapatalk forum, even though most of the community has moved on to the Discord opened by Clear Sky. For a while, it seemed like DT would remain in this state forever, a game to be played and talked about in niche circles and have a slight bump in popularity when Fightcade picked it up. However, in mid-2019, reports began to circulate that Zero Div, a company owned by City Connection that now owns Psikyo's back catalog, was going to re-release the game for the EXA Arcadia arcade platform, and after a time in the arcades, port the game to consoles. Not only was the game going to be released, it was going to be finished with the 4 unfinished characters from the game's code being put in, as well as rebalancing the fighting itself. To say the community was blown away from this is an understatement. The Discord and forums were abuzz with talk, discussion, and general happiness that the game would be finished and the Steel Hearts team's vision would have a chance at being realized. By October of the same year, however, jack all had been followed up on in regards to DT Complete Edition, save for the game getting a big fat Coming Soon section on EXA Arcadia's website. I reached out to EXA on Twitter and asked them if DT Complete Edition was still happening, and they replied with a short but succinct yes. I thanked them and said that's great, I look forward to playing it. By 2020, however, there was still no updates or info. Eventually, fed up with waiting, I went to City Connection's Japanese website and sent a message on the customer feedback form. They confirmed to me that they were in fact not working on anything related to the Fallen Angels at that time. I made a video declaring the game all but dead, and honestly, who could be surprised if it were, given that the announcement of its development began right before the beginning of
COVID-19.
Strangely enough, not long after my Daraku Tenshi Complete Edition is Probably Dead video, EXA Arcadia updated their website to include a Coming 2021 tag on Daraku Tenshi's page. Needless to say, that did not happen. They did update the game's page again to say Coming in 22 once 2022 rolled around. Needless to say, the community, much like Kim Wilde, is disappointed in the way that EXA seems to just keep us hanging on. Literally, as I was typing this script, yeah, I do scripts now, I decided to go and check the page on EXA one more time to make sure I had the latest info. I noticed that in addition to changing the release date to 2022, they made one tinier update to the page. If you use the Wayback Machine to go back to January, you'll see a small section listed which shows the game as being in development by City Connection and EXA, but when they updated the page, it now says that the game is in development in conjunction with Psikyo, EXA Arcadia Team EXA AM6. They completely removed mention of City Connection and just said they're developing it in conjunction with Psikyo. Now, Psikyo has been dead a long time, so I don't know if they did that to just mean it was Psikyo's game and they're finishing it or what. But the interesting thing is the EXA AM6 team. I did some digging, and the EXA AM6 is the designation of one of EXA's internal teams, so it seems like EXA is now taking the lead on the DT Complete project. Update. City Connection is now back on the site, so who knows what's actually going on with this title, if anything at all. At this point, I think most DT fans would just be happy to know the game existed and that they could play it one day. One day, I will start the game and select Lapis. I can feel it. Daraku Tenshi has a complicated legacy, an ambitious project that was never finished but released anyway, that eventually found itself endeared to many via the miracle of emulation. All of the mechanics in DT have been done by other games at that point, and its gameplay isn't perfect. But ironically, the air of mystery surrounding it has captured the steel hearts and minds of many. I can't stand here and say to you that I would care as much about the game as I do if it had been finished, but at least the timeline that we live in, that it wasn't finished, and myself and so many others do care. Ironically, it may be because the game was left unfinished that it ends up getting the release it so deserved. Unless the project is dead and EXA just won't come out and say it for some strange reason, which is entirely possible. Thanks so much for watching one of my longest videos ever. If you like this video and you want to see more, consider dropping a subscribe and ringing the bell so that you get new videos delivered directly to your face. Also, a like and a comment always helps that mysterious YouTube algorithm. I am genuinely interested to see your comments and thoughts about the future of Daraku Tenshi. Will the complete edition ever come out? Is the game doomed to be relegated to obscurity forever? Let me know what you think below, and I'll see you next time.